Hello everybody and welcome back to the 5th Dev Diary of Grey Eminence. We're not doing these in order because I'm doing them just in a order that I think works. We've talked about characters. Now let's talk about what those characters believe in the religious sense. I still love these artworks, by the way, as all the Dev Diary images are really pretty. I like them quite a lot. Okay, so religion, obviously a massive force, especially during the earlier parts of the time frame of our wonderful game here. Let's talk a little bit about what religion does and how they are defined. So, in Great Eminence, religions are not monolithic. Instead, they are collections of individual denominations. So, for example, Christianity is a religion with lots of different denominations. All Christians believe in the Abrahamic God. There's very little agreement on the finer details. So you're going to have something somewhat similar to the kind of breakdown of, it might work differently, but the breakdown of EU4, right? When each country has some people they view as heathens and some people they view as heretics. Heathens being people who are outside of their denomination, outside of their religion, and heretics as people who are of a different denomination. So, the majority of the game's religious mechanics are expressed at the denomination level. So there's not that many things that actually define religions. It's mostly about denominations. Each denomination is defined by doctrines, stances, and idiosyncrasies, I think. Idiosyncrasies. Here's how you pronounce it. The combination does not have to be unique, which is interesting. So you can have two denominations with the same doctrines, stances, and idiosyncrasies. So let's talk about doctrines first. They define the overall structure and the high-level stuff about the religion in the game. So for example, we're not going to go through all of the doctrines in this Dev Diary, but we'll talk about clerical structure. Clerical structure tells us how the clergy of a given denomination is organized, if it is, in fact, organized. It has knock-on effects for all kinds of other things. 4 options, okay, in this particular doctrine. Unorganized, autonomous, semi-autonomous, and centralized. Okay, so pretty simple where these are going to go. When a denomination is unorganized, there are no formal clergy. This doctrine is most common among folk religions, though it can appear elsewhere. Countries that follow unorganized denominations don't have a clergy elite. So we can see how this feeds into the elites we were talking about in the previous video. This will actually determine whether you have a clergy elite, which is interesting because in that Dev Diary, they're talking about laws always defining whether elites exist. We now actually can see it's more complicated than that. The nature of your religion can actually determine whether or not you have a clergy elite. Significant implications for their power balance, of course. Without the clergy, the other elites have one less counterweight to worry about in their quest for power. There are other impacts. Education is more difficult in pre-industrial societies without the clergy, because of course the clergy were historically a very sizable portion of the kind of literate and educated group. So without the clergy, less educated people, education is going to be harder. We're not talking about Reformation today, but you can change from a disorganized denomination to a organized one. It's worth mentioning, there is a difference between disorganized and unorganized. I'm going to try and remember to keep saying unorganized, because there is this unorganized implies more intention behind it, right? They're trying not to be organized and not have a clergy, whereas disorganized implies they kind of have a clergy, but it sucks, right? Yeah, and you can reform them much more easily when they're disorganized because there's no clergy elite that's going to say, oi, no, you can't do that, and we're going to use our property to stop you. Autonomous denominations have a clergy, but it's purely local. Makes sense, right? No overall hierarchical structure, just local. It's going to mean that it's more at the mercy of you because it can't kind of organize and be collective in the way that things can. Then you have semi-autonomous denominations. They have a clergy, but no organization beyond the country level. Makes sense, right? Like it calls Eastern Orthodox Christianity an example of this. I'm not convinced it always is at the moment, but it can be. It definitely can be. So it's interesting. You do have a clerical structure, but it's one country. And then you have centralized. So that's obviously your Catholic, basically, in 1356, where there is one fully fledged head of faith, which is a multinational position. So you can see how that's going to have different impacts, including things like cross-border tides, globe-spanning conclaves. Very cool potential stuff there. Here we have the UI for this, and I said this in the Discord when this Dev Diary first came out. This is really pretty. I know the idea of UI is not always to be pretty, but this is not something you're going to look at that regularly. These little icons, they're so clear. They're really evocative of what they're talking about. I really like this. I think this is very, very nicely done. Call for reform button, always interesting. Next, we have stances. So historically, one of the purposes of religion was to tell you how to live your life. This is where stances come in. So this is going to be about attitudes towards things. And the example they talk about here is divorce. And if you have stance conflicts, it can grow into schisms, and all kinds of awesome stuff could arise from that, of course. So for divorce, for example, it can be forbidden, spiritually approved, and allowed. Spiritually approved, presumably meaning the clergy can allow you to get a divorce, but otherwise it's not possible. So then there's also annulment, which is still possible even in forbidden, but it's going to have a bigger process behind it. For a monarchy, annulment can have disastrous consequences. Let's say he decides to annul his marriages and marry someone else, even if the head of faith agrees to it, which they might not, leading to a host of other problems. You've suddenly got a succession crisis on your hands. Any children of the annulled marriage would be considered illegitimate, which they may not take well, and I have to imagine that they could still potentially get some support, even as illegitimate heirs. Spiritually approved divorce places the process under the control of the clergy. Depending on their power, they might extract a harsh cost in donations or favours for granting the privilege of divorce. Makes sense, right? And here we can see some of the other stances. I don't know if this is all of the ones that exist. There may well be more. But these are the kind of things that we're used to from CK2, CK3, especially custom religions and things in CK3. You've got gender rights, sodomy, marriage, divorce, adultery, and incest. It's interesting that they're calling it sodomy, because traditionally in Christian, well, I mean, again, not a historian, not a theologian, in lots of historical Christian law in Europe, what has been illegal or frowned upon, although it was only, again, not an expert, but lots of it was only made illegal relatively recently, and then of course recently, even more recently re-legalized, was not being gay, which is what you might expect to see here, and is what you would see here in CK3, for example. It's actually specifically sodomy. So that being criminal, obviously, makes sense for Christianity. I don't know if that's also true in other places, though, or to what extent it makes sense to talk about sodomy as opposed to, homosexual relations, because obviously they're not the same. But it'd be interesting to see what other stances there are here, as well as what impact these things have. In CK3, when you do something that's naughty in your religion or culture or whatever, people get a hook on you, and then that can lead to other things. I wonder how that will work out here. It'll be interesting. Maybe the clergy just dislikes you, or maybe, I'm sure it will depend on all kinds of other things. Next, idiosyncrasies. So far, we've covered religious mechanics that are shared by all denominations. Idiosyncrasies are unique mechanics that are usually restricted to certain religious or theological doctrines. So, for example, baptism, legalism, human sacrifice, and pacifism. So you can't, it seems, just be a Catholic and go, you know what? Human sacrifice seems fun. They did it to our God, so we might as well do it to each other, and then just start doing random human sacrifices. These are the kind of things that it seems like have to be part of a religion from the beginning, basically, in order to actually allow them to exist. Monasticism is another interesting example of this, present in most Christian and some Buddhist and Hindu denominations. Countries or elites that follow monastic denominations can construct monasteries which employ monks and nuns. These spiritual sanctuaries significantly increase the literacy rate of their communities, very cool, and can accelerate the emergence of certain technologies. They also provide a convenient location to exile your unneeded heirs or defeated political opponents. Very cool. So there's a kind of force them to take the vows mechanic that we've seen in CK2 and 3, maybe, which is also obviously very useful if your firstborn son sucks and you need him to not be in the line of succession, or if your secondborn son is not as good as the first but very ambitious and you might want to shuffle him out of the way. Makes sense. Next, Reformation, heresy, and schism. We previously mentioned that religions and cultures in great eminence aren't static. Let's get into a bit on how the denominations can change. Ooh. A lot of what we've heard so far is, here's how it is, here's how things can change, always makes me excited. Reformation and heresy are the two main ways a denomination can change, and they're really two sides of the same coin. Both processes aim to change aspects of a certain denomination. They can be any combination of doctrines, stances, and idiosyncrasies. Their outcomes, however, are radically different. In the case of Reformation, the denomination remains whole, albeit modified. With heresy, an entirely new denomination emerges and challenges the previous order. So much of this sounds so cool, man. I really want to play this game. There are two ways in which a Reformation or heresy can start, top down or bottom up. And this feeds really nicely into what we were talking about the other day about the great man versus class struggle and economy kind of dichotomy in how history works. Top-down calls for reform originate from the people in positions of power, rulers, heads of faith, members of an elite. Makes sense. For example, a Catholic king might be so unhappy with the Pope for rejecting his annulment request that he tries to start his own denomination, where a divorce is allowed. Looking at you, Henry VIII. On the flip side, when multiple rulers, I don't think he did allow divorce, by the way. He just made himself able to grant annulments, but again, not a historian, so I could be wrong. On the flip side, when multiple rulers or high-level clergy members campaign for the same cause, honest reformation is possible. For denominations with non-centralized structures, the same conflicts happen on a smaller scale within the country. Change can also arise from the population. So non-elites, it seems like, can try and bring about these things. Low-born preachers may appear, whose teachings you can encourage or suppress. Heresy is sometimes disrupted. It can also bring opportunity. Crucially, religious fragmentation does not need to happen for purely theological reasons. Politics can inspire characters to branch out without meaningful differences. So the obvious example of this is, yes, what they talk about, the anti-popes, the fact that in Catholic Europe, there were very often two different or multiple different, I don't think there were more than three, but different Catholic groups respecting different popes in different locations. The Pope in Avignon versus the Pope in Rome being the most famous example. So that makes sense. Schisms are reversible, unlike heresies. So that's two interesting facts there. You can't reverse heresies. You can't have Protestantism and Catholicism make nice. And schisms, you can, though, which is interesting. I guess the only way to reverse a heresy is just to obliterate one part of it, which, seems plausible. And that is religion. I'm interested to see what the other stances are. I'm also very interested to see what the possible gender rights are and what kind of impacts they have. As well as marriage, like what is marriage going to do? It might just, because what I really want is for these not to just apply to the characters that you actually have, the people, the agents, right? Which are what we now know characters to be. I want them to be impactful on everyone. I want there to be societal impacts of allowing non-monogamous marriage, for example, because there's all kinds of interesting things that could come of that in terms of, I don't know. I don't even know. But there's all kinds of interesting societies you can imagine and build, which would be really cool with that if these actually have beyond character implications. Even if they just have character implications, still cool though. And look at this. It's so pretty. Just the clarity and kind of, I don't know. These are just, to me, these are very communicative icons. And I really like that. There you go. Grey, Eminence, religion. In the next one, we will look at something that is treated in many games and in many people's minds as entirely separate from religion. Not really true, but, we make abstractions as we must, which is, in fact, culture. So we're going to look at culture in next episode. Until then, thanks for watching. Link to the full dev diary if you want to peruse it yourself is in the description, and I will see you all next time.